Well, it's good to be here as well. I mean, I'm very proud to be launching the session because obviously Balliol was in at the inception of the OII, and we think of ourselves as the founding college of the OII. So it's very good to be here. I'm really actually impersonating Bill Button. I mean, Bill's here, so I don't really have to do any impersonation. Other than the connection between Balliol and the OII founding, I don't know that there's much reason for me to be here. In fact, because I'm only a subscriber to one actual social networking site, and it's a protected site. So I don't think I really count in this community at all, do I, really? But I do actually subscribe to one chatter site, so I suppose that just about allows me in here, does it, James? I mean,
I think it does. We'll let you in.
Just about legal, as they say. Obviously, we've got James Manyika here with us. We've got Marc Ventresca with us as well. We're waiting for Michael Chui. We won't wait, but Michael Chui is on his way from Heathrow. He's been delayed because of the storms in New York again, and we know he has actually landed. We know he is, so he is actually coming. James, of course, is a senior partner at McKinsey and the leader of the MGI group, which put together the study in which this evening's seminar is based, and he's a joint author, I think, of that study with Michael. Maybe more to the point, he's also an Oxford engineer and indeed a Balliol fellow. So I suppose that gives me another reason for being here. The study, of course, is about the much greater implications, and in particular commercial implications, social implications, of social networking over the next few years, and the fact that the study thinks there's huge gains to be made, but huge issues also in the way. And I think James is going to talk about 5 particular kinds of opportunity for commercial, I think, and one maybe in the social area, and suggest some levers which can actually help unlock the potential in these areas, while at the same time considering the difficulties, which again I think are going to be mainly social rather than technological. And I'm just going to hand over to James, and with any luck Michael will come in and kind of join in, and then at the end of it it's a free-for-all. Okay, thanks for coming, James.
Thank you, Drummond. Thank you for inviting us to come give this talk. We're delighted to be here. I'm personally delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Oxford and to Balliol. A couple words of to beg your indulgence before we get started. We've had all kinds of travel and IT issues. So Michael's not here. I just got here literally a minute ago. So we're still getting ourselves organized. And we've also had all kinds of IT issues. So I'm going to try and present in a weird kind of way, mostly scrolling through some material. So bear with me if it looks a little odd, because Michael actually has the presentation that we were originally going to use. But having said that, I think what we wanted to do is to talk about a few things. First, to describe by way of introduction the work that we do at MGI. I think that might be a useful backdrop to this conversation. And then talk a little bit about our motivations for doing this study, but more importantly, discuss the impact of social media, social technologies, less from a social point of view, mostly from what some of the commercial applications are, the commercial implications, and how businesses and sectors, quite often the ones that we work with, think about this and some of the issues that they're grappling with. So we'll talk through some examples of that. First, by way of introduction, as Drummond said, I sort of have 2 roles at McKinsey. I'm a senior partner. I work a lot with Silicon Valley companies in our technology and media practice. That's kind of one part of what I do. But the other part of what I do, which I think is appropriate for this conversation, is I lead our McKinsey Global Institute. What that is, it's our version of a think tank at McKinsey. We've had it for 25 years. And what we do is we tend to focus a lot on big macro issues. And we take what we talk about as a micro-based macro approach. What we mean by that is we try and understand macroeconomic issues, but from the basis of the micro work we do in sectors and with companies, and sort of try and merge the two. And we've had now for the last several years a major technology program where we look at the impact of technology on business and the economy. So some of you may have seen work we've done on the impact of the internet, on big data. And so early this year, actually we started last year, we decided to spend a fair amount of time looking at the impact of social technologies to understand the business and the economic implications of that. So that's what I'm going to describe. Just by way of background, again, the sort of sources of data, to those of you who are interested in this, that we typically use for this kind of work, is we use all the typical survey data that some of you may see and use. But more importantly, we also have the benefit of the data that many of our clients have, on the basis that we obviously strip away company names and all of that. So we have the benefit of both the outside view as well as the inside view from many of the technology companies that we work with. I thought what I might just do by way of as a starting point, and I think some of these may be things that people in this room will be familiar with, but maybe not all of them, by way of highlights from the report. I thought I would talk through some of the, if you like, the data highlights from this. Let me see if we can get this to work. I think we can. There we go. Not quite. Let's try again. This is where the improvisation comes in. So I'm drawing from the actual report itself. But I think one of the quite remarkable things to note is just the sheer number of people who are actually using these social networks. At the time of writing, I think the precise number when we did the actual demographic count was 1.4 billion. This was at the end of 2011. And we estimate at this point in time, based on the data sources that we have, we're actually close to 1.9 billion in terms of people who are actually actively using social media of one form or another, which is an enormous number if you think about it. And what's also interesting is that increasingly, many people are online. This has actually become the only vehicle by which to spend time online. So we estimate, for example, based on the source that we have, that something as close to 80% of people online are actually using social media. What's interesting about that, when you go by geography, we were actually quite struck, for example, on some data sets we got looking at countries like India and parts of Africa and Asia, for example, that for some people, their only experience of the internet is through social media. In fact, we did some survey work, for example, in Kenya and parts of India, and people who've never had an email address have a Facebook page, or at least interact on Facebook. So for many, many people, increasingly the new people who've just joined or come to the internet, usually through mobile devices or in developing economies and developing countries, this is their introduction to the internet, which I think is quite striking. Whereas when you look at this number, for example, in the context of most advanced economies, the activity being spent on social media is mostly taking away from other forms of interaction and communication. In fact, those of you who might have looked at the actual report and the details, it's quite striking. For example, in the US, that we did some analysis for the US and for Germany in particular, that if you look at age cohorts, and you look at the total time spent using digitally enabled communications of one sort or another, for people under the age of 25, the growth in use of social media is actually coming at the expense of certainly email and certainly voice communications, even voice telephone communications. So that's taking away a lot of the minutes of use on cell phones, for example, where people are often opting to interact this way as opposed to cell phones. Part of the reason why that question will come to it later is very interesting is that for many of our clients or many companies for whom they've thought about their economics and their business models, assuming certain amounts of telephony use, data usage, as those usage patterns shift to this, think about what that does to their economics. This is some very real implications we'll come back to around what the growth of social media does to the economics of companies who've assumed revenue models and business models of a particular sort. But anyway, we thought that 80% number was quite striking. What's also striking as you start to look at companies is that Many companies now actually report use of social media in one form or another inside the corporations. And I'll come back in a second and talk about what we're including in our kind of scope of what we're calling social media. But it's actually quite striking. What's also particularly striking is what they're using that for. And we'll get into some of that shortly. But there's a lot of penetration. And what's also even more interesting is you're starting to see companies report benefits to their business from the use of social media. There's also the other side of that, by the way, which we'll come to as well, which is some perhaps more challenging implications and disruptions to their business models through the use of social media. So I wanted to highlight at least some of these data sets. One of the surprising things was just the sheer amount of time people actually spend in social media. In fact, it's quite striking. I mean, you see here 28 hours per week. In the United States, for example, there's roughly, people typically spend about 11 hours per day on kind of in sort of content consumption and interaction, digitally enabled content consumption or interaction of one sort or another. So think television, think email, think cell phones, etc. It's about 11 hours actually, which is a huge amount. And increasingly, the fastest growing share of that is again social media. If you allocate the actual average of 11 hours, the fastest share of that is coming from social media. One of the things that we'll talk quite a bit about is, so what does this all mean? And we in the course of this work, we actually did, in addition to this kind of the macro data that I'm describing, we looked quite deeply in 5 sectors to try and understand the impact in those sectors of the use of these technologies. And much of the impact from that will, if you look at it function by function, and we'll go into a picture here shortly, comes mostly from either a lot of marketing-like benefits, a lot of productivity-like benefits, and a lot of knowledge worker-like benefits are the big benefits that we're talking about. But at the same time, there are also benefits that are going to come from new offers and new forms of interactions that are going to be made possible, and we'll come back to that. The one number that many of our clients think a lot about, and in some ways also worry about, both from a positive and a negative standpoint, is the amount of their revenues that are actually influenced by what actually happens in social media. So this number represents, this is for consumer shopping activity, both either through promotions that could be that companies typically run through social media, but also disruptions. I mean, the interesting example that we came up with, and we did some work with, I probably shouldn't, won't talk about company names, but think about the movie industry as an example. It used to be the case that if you had an opening for a movie and the movie wasn't very good, for whatever reason, no one would know for several months, actually. So you could keep running, people could keep showing up. But the difference between what now happens in social media, when you have a movie opening and it bombs and people talk about it through social media, if you look at the economics of the economic curves of the revenue stream that goes with movies, I mean, so 20 years ago, studios would plot that curve a certain way. So you'd release the movie in one country, the tail comes off slowly, you release in another country. So the cumulative economics of that were actually pretty attractive. Now today, with simultaneous openings globally, and in a social media mediated world, unless you have a blockbuster in the first few days, it can drop pretty precipitously because everybody talks about it. Social media talks about it. So the category of products, and I'm just using movies as an example, where you're talking either about experience products or call it fashion products, and those kinds of products that have perception and shared experience kind of characteristics, is very, very susceptible to what happens in social media. And those companies worry and think a lot about this, actually. And we'll show some data, but roughly about a third of consumer shopping now gets influenced positively and negatively by what happens in social media. And it's a big deal for those companies. The other sort of benefits we'll talk about have a lot more to do with just the collaborative nature of most corporations and most enterprises these days. And many of those actually benefit a lot from the kind of the social interactions that happen through social media, discovering who experts are in an organization, finding out, knowing almost the social graphic structure of a company, where you get to find out, as opposed to going to the expert that's been appointed by the company, so to speak, you can actually look at the social graph and figure out who the real expert is that everybody else is going to. So companies are starting to use almost nodal social structure, social graphic analysis to understand the dynamics of organizations and actually increase productivity and effectiveness. And you see a lot of those kinds of benefits. And that's what typically translates to many of the knowledge worker productivity. So that's just some of the big numbers and features that came out of the research. Let me go into some of the other things that we found quite interesting. And this is where, again, I'm begging your indulgence here, because we're doing this in a very unorthodox fashion because of the challenges with that Michael actually has a presentation that we had. So I'm pulling from the actual report itself. One of the things that's worth talking about a little bit is, so what are we actually including in terms of social media, so to speak? I think we've got the social networks, but we think that's actually a very somewhat narrow definition of social media, because in our minds we're thinking about technologies that allow group interaction, where people express opinions, share technologies, share experiences, comment on it in a socially mediated group fashion, as opposed to technologies that encourage individual work. So in many ways, blogs to a large extent, especially the microblogs that have a community around them, as opposed to ones that are one-way broadcast, we would think of that as social media. Certainly a big growing part of that is the ratings and review sites, because those are the ones, in fact, often those are the ones that have the biggest commercial impact, because that's where people, when they've experienced, whether they've experienced a doctor or experienced a particular store or branch or a particular movie for that matter, get to comment and share experiences, and the classic like or dislike or don't like button. And by the way, that's one of the ones that has, as I said, the biggest impact in the economics of most companies. Then you've got a lot of social commerce that happens, people recommending products and things to each other. Some of that happens within social networks in the traditional sense, as in Facebook and other places, but often that actually happens in other micro-social environments, whether it's inside companies or one of the things that's quite striking, and I don't know to what extent people realize the extent that this is happening. Most corporations have now created all sorts of microsites. Some of those use Facebook and the traditional Twitter sites as kind of subdomains to interact with their own microsites. So there's a lot of microsites where a lot of social commerce actually occurs. And there are lots of companies that are actually enabling and making that possible. That's Google's doing some of that, less so Facebook. But that's actually becoming a very interesting arena for where commerce occurs. So these are the kinds of things we're thinking about when we think about social media. One of the other things that's quite striking, I don't know if there are any historians in the room here. Wanted to point out that actually, let me talk about this for a little bit. This goes to the, just historically, the time people spend using different, if you like, consuming and interacting around content and particular forms of communication and interaction. As you can see, in person is one that's been obviously been there since time immemorial. But what's interesting is that the growth of the technology-mediated ones. And in that context, actually, social networks are still relatively at the beginning, at the low end. Now, you could start to include instant messenger and SMS and so forth, but that these are still growing, and and the potential is still significant. So one of the things the reason we want to point this out is, even though the roughly 1.9 billion people are now using social media sounds like a very large number, most of that is happening in the traditionally defined social networks, and we think that we're likely to see the expansion of things where social media penetrates. In fact, one of the, if you like, perhaps provocative things you could say about this is that in some ways, if we think about social media just as Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus and so forth, that's actually a very narrow view. Think about all the experiences where you could imagine attaching a like and dislike button. So, for example, I'll give a printer example, and even companies are starting to think about this. Imagine where you've got a communal printer, that several people in a department or in a work group are using a printer. And imagine if the printer had a like and dislike button. And every time somebody used it, you could actually calibrate your experience with it. I like that experience, I like that color calibration, and the printer is changing the way it does certain things, so that after a while, the behavior and profile of that printer has now been communally and socially defined. So think about those examples. Think about perhaps, I think Oxford is now doing this, rating your professors, rating your dons, rating lecturers. So think about the things where you could imagine a social group that has a shared experience of that get to rate it. So that view of social media, in our view, has only just begun. There are many, many more things. So think about all the communal, digitally intermediate interactions that you have, where there's a community around it. Those could all have social as a feature, if you like, applied to them. So we think the view of thinking about social media just as Facebook and Twitter, we think is a very narrow view. But if you think about the more expansive view that we're describing, again, the implications for companies and consumers become more interesting. Certainly for consumers, I think there's a potential for huge amounts of consumer surplus and benefit, because hopefully the communally defined printer starts to behave the way that community prefers it to work, and hopefully that's a benefit to that particular community. But also for companies, think about the kind of feedback and the kind of experiences that they get back as feedback. So think about the way marketing departments get to look. I think traditionally, if you go function by function inside companies, a traditional marketing department does research, or they'll go and do focus groups, then they'll come back and then decide what it is that they're going to develop. But in a socially mediated world, all of these things could be almost perpetual experiments. You could be trying out different things. Again, think about the printer. That could actually be a research function for a marketing department. How do people like their printer to work? How do they like it configured? Do they like this starter screen as the first screen, or do they prefer to start by choosing colors first before choosing how many pages they want to print? Think about the kind of the research aspects of socially mediated interactions of that form and how tailored they could become. So you can imagine companies that get very good at this could actually become very, very agile as compared to companies that do years of research to try and figure out what it is that consumers want and then try and sell that to everybody. You're already seeing this in the form of, for example, retail sites, whether you think of an Amazon or even what Google does. So one of the things that is interesting about Google, for example, is that they've historically had a metric that something like 1% of the traffic on the site is participating in an experiment of some sort or other. So in other words, we may not know this, but at any one time, the site doesn't look exactly, if you're in that 1%, doesn't look exactly the way it does for everybody. The links are coming back slightly different, the colors are slightly different, and they're seeing, well, does that cause you to click through in a certain way, or do you then click through in a different way? So think of this idea as almost the notion of perpetual experiments of this form, and how much more tailored then products become. So we think that's quite interesting. As perhaps my comments already suggest, let me talk a little bit about the kind of impacts that we see. As you might imagine from the way I'm talking about this, there are some sectors, if you look at this as a sector map, there are some sectors where the impact of these technologies are likely to be larger than others. The ones that tend to have a large potential tend to be the ones where there are a lot of consumer interactions, if you like. So think about retail industries. Think about the healthcare sector, where people have experiences with doctors and hospitals and medicines, etc. So whenever the number of sort of human or entity or company to consumer interactions are very high, the potential impact is very high. The other dimension that also comes out in the empirical research that we did is sectors where you happen to have a lot of knowledge workers or collaborative work going on. Again, those lend themselves to social structures which tend to benefit from social media. Whenever you have a social structure, group collaboration, teamwork, and so forth. So we think that the two dominant things that tend to determine the potential impact tend to be the large number of consumer interactions as well as the large number of sort of knowledge workers and collaborative workers in the enterprise. Then you've got a dimension that we also looked at, which is, how easy is it to capture these benefits? And I think these dimensions, as we thought about it and also saw the number of companies taking advantage of these, often have to do with the technology investments that these companies in these sectors have actually made, but also considerations of privacy and regulatory concerns. Because as you might imagine, in fact, you may have seen the recent example in the EU about just the sheer amount of information that, say, for example, a social site like a Facebook can actually capture about you, and the social graph that can be constructed from that. So think about, at least the way I like to think about it, it's almost, think about, any kind of real-world social group of people and friends in the real world. Before these technologies, a group has group dynamics. You know who's a member of the group. How, certain people talk more to each other than others. Certain people are more trusted on certain issues than others. And you have power dynamics within that group. Now think about when you then apply that to social media. You've now taken real-world social structures almost to internet scale, with the additional fact that you now capture that information digitally in the social graph. So you actually know how many times did these two people in this group talk to each other and about what. Who do people go to for what information? So think about two things, both the social structure of normal human groups raised to internet scale with the information digitally captured, and with the interactions having the added benefit of almost internet economics, so marginal economics, so the ease, the cost of sending that extra bit of information or that extra document or retweeting that is marginally zero. So you've got internet economics at internet scale in a way that's digitally captured. So as you might imagine, there are both benefits and concerns that go with that. And you've all had the issues about, well, can you actually delete this information, and does it really ever go away, or is it really always captured? So there's clearly concerns, and so what you often see is that the ease of capture often has a lot to do, yes, some technology and commercial questions, but also these kind of privacy and other almost policy, regulatory kinds of considerations. And I would hope that somebody at the OI is thinking a lot about those kinds of questions. We tend to focus more on the commercial side of things. Let me actually, that leads me to another point that I think is worth discussing, which is, if you think about the economic impact of these things, I mean, we've talked about the benefits and risks for companies in terms of revenues and so forth. In fact, actually, let me show something here that you might find interesting, but on the benefits for companies. This is based on research that we did in the United States, and Europe here really is Germany and France, to be specific. It was most where we did the deep research on it. But it's looking at the purchasing and shopping that is increasingly becoming social. So this says, if you look at typical electronics products, so think of laptops, computers, and so forth. The dark blue shows the places where, in fact, people are influenced by suggestions and comments in social media, and then the next grade of blue here talks to influences that come from other digital sources, all the way to the right where these are truly word of mouth that are not digitally mediated. As you can see, and we've actually tracked this over the last 4 years, the dark blue has been growing the fastest. So you're having more and more things, and it's interesting that some categories are impacted more than others. So you see, for example, purchase of electronics or computer hardware, mobile phones, highly impacted, at least this is as of 2011, and then appliances and so forth. And then less so groceries, for example, much less so. Although you're starting to see that, for example, where people don't so much comment on the groceries themselves, but the experience in a particular store. So if you go to Yelp, for example, there's a lot of reviews about the grocery shopping experience in this store versus that store. So while that may not be about a particular product, grocery product per se, it's often about the experience of shopping. So you now have people talk about the experience in a particular street fair or street market or farmer's market that tends to then drive a lot of traffic about which farmer's market to go to, for example, on a Saturday versus not. So you're starting to see a lot of categories get impacted by that. And what's interesting is that the number here is actually very large. And this is as of end of 2011. 940 billion influenced by social media already. And the number is growing. So we're talking about large amounts that both are opportunities as well as risks. Let me go to the other side of this, which is one of the things we end up spending a lot of time on. If you look at it from the vendor's point of view, so the companies who are creating these technologies, and I'm not about to go into a discussion about Facebook's valuation, but it's sort of, you have to think about the vendors for these technologies, which is, so how are they going to make money? So most internet companies, for the most part, are making most of their revenues through advertising. Now there's a debate about how much of that can you really do within social media and social networks. It turns out that the search companies actually have found a good answer for that. Because apparently, so it turns out that people are generally comfortable with advertising linked to search, less so advertising linked to social media. So there's a real question here about how do you think about the business models for the vendors. I think is a real question, and many companies are thinking a lot about that. And for the economists in the room, one of the most interesting areas where there's a lot of experimentation going on beyond looking just at advertising, and companies are doing all forms of this, and we've worked with some of them. This idea of looking at multi-sided business models, which is, can you take activity going on in one arena and capture interesting information that helps you solve a different problem in a different market and use that as a way to monetize this activity, which is mostly going to be free, as a way to try and avoid just everything defaulting to advertising. So there's a lot of experimentation going on at the moment. We'll see which models turn out to be successful. But that's one of the places where people are thinking about, there must be a way, because this is valuable. So you're starting to see that, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, where people think that there must be something useful about the comments and experiences people have with particular treatments or drugs and so forth, without advertising to them. But is that information, can that be used for research or monetized in a different way, in a different market, in a way that doesn't have you just do advertising? So I think we're going to see a lot of experimentation and models being applied to how to monetize and make the most of these technologies. Let me pause at that point for a moment, unless there are any questions. the other place I'd like to go is to go to some of the particular deep cases we did in the sectors that we looked at in some detail.
Okay, thanks, James. We've got Marc Ventresca here, who's an economic sociologist from the Saïd School. Balliol's going to claim the Saïd School as well, of course, because the dean is a Balliol guy. Marc, do you want to kick off with a few observations?
Will now all of a sudden have internet scale. So I think just as we think about the benefits of this, it's actually worth pointing those things, the dark sides of this as well, and to what extent we ought to be concerned about that or not. The other comment to make is that in almost all the economic research and in commercial applications of this that we've looked at, the overwhelming beneficiary is actually the consumer. The amount of this that is transferring into mostly consumer surplus that, quite frankly, the companies are going to have a hard time capturing is actually quite enormous. So at least, not that we should put aside privacy concerns, but at least as consumers, we actually stand to benefit more than the companies do. And the companies mostly are trying to catch up with thinking through the business model questions, but the overwhelming benefit is accruing to consumers. There one small point about, and because we're at an academic institution, I've actually been quite struck, and I can talk about this because it's not a commercial entity, it's not a commercial company, but it's an interesting application of some of these things. The Khan Academy is fascinating. And back to Michael's comment about now we have the chance to actually understand and capture empirical data on how learning happens is interesting. So I don't know if any of you have experienced the Khan Academy and gone to the site and looked at the videos or learned the things that you do there. If you haven't, you should. But what's interesting about that is because they now have delivered something like 20 million lessons, algebra, calculus, and so forth, mostly to kids ages between 7 and typically 12 and 15. Now they actually know, does somebody ultimately learn all of basic mathematics faster if they start with calculus or geometry? Because you can actually follow and track who progressed through the whole collection faster. So if you start here, do you end up with a better result than if you start here? So now all of a sudden, you actually have interesting new empirical data about actual experiences that you can actually capture. So I think as many of these things, as Michael pointed out, as a social research tool about real behavior, as opposed to asking people in surveys, because before you typically ask people in surveys, as opposed to actually looking at what they're actually doing. We think the research potential of this is enormous. And it's also the reason that gives companies some hope that there must be other ways to monetize this beyond charging the consumers or advertising, because surely the massive information in an aggregated form is probably interesting to somebody trying to solve a different problem. So that also creates possibilities from a business model innovation standpoint.
Thanks very much, James. Yeah, that last point is actually one that I've had personal experience of. I've been involved in a wholly online higher education program. And what we discovered very quickly was that every single interaction between tutor and student was actually monitored in that wholly online environment. And you could actually, in fact, feed back and discover exactly, as you say, what works and what doesn't work across a large number of people. And you didn't have to use the kind of student surveys you'd use in a physical environment. And some of the answers were quite surprising and quite different. So, I mean, that's absolutely right. I was also struck earlier on by, just before I throw it over to the audience, by James's analogy about the colour printer. Two thoughts crossed my mind. One, of course, the automotive industry downloads all your throttle and braking movements every time your car is serviced, so they discover how the car is actually used and they can make it better for the next generation. At least that's the theory. That's fine. But of course a lot of cars also have, like James's putative colour printer, have fly-by-wire technology which self-learns. Well, that's absolutely wonderful until your partner gets a hold of the car for 3,000 miles and has a very different driving style. And you go back in and you're completely wrecked. Okay, over to the...
I apologize. There's
Yeah,
an interesting article. My TiVo thinks I'm gay. For some reason, and so then the person keeps trying to watch American football repeatedly to try to convince it that it. You know,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Terrific. Terrific hearing from you both, and Mark as well. I mean, stimulate discussion. Over to the audience. I've got Bill, and then I've got 3 here.
Very, very quickly, you could probably hold this maybe, but I just am confused about using social media to really capture the value for a company. You mentioned, Michael, the difficulty of really planning this, but it's, for example, a movie producer might not have used their own social media, but people will rate their movie, and they don't have any choice. I mean, other people. Colleges may not want to have their teachers rated, but students created Rate My Teacher.
Right.
So they have no choice. I mean, the world is using social media, so the company doesn't have real control. And again, you don't know what will work. I mean, you can try to create a social media site, but nobody will come. But if it's more bottom up so it's very hard for a company, I think, to be the user and be in control in this, in the driver's seat.
Is it helpful for me to reflect on that?
Yeah,
I think certainly for some applications, you know, Bill, that dynamic's going to happen, right? So, you know, is it the case that a company's products and services and their quality is going to be rated and influenced by social communications that happens through these technologies, whether or not the company chooses to? Absolutely. And we have this discussion with our clients all the time. You know, you can get involved in this discussion or listen to it, but it's going to happen with or without you. So that's definitely true. The challenge that I was describing is that 2/3 of the value potential that comes from using these technologies within and across the enterprise to improve collaboration and communication. You know, it is true there's a little bit of that going on, but in general, you know, that's going to work at scale when it's sanctioned by the organization. Now, there are guerrilla attempts, right? Because you can sign up a whole bunch of employees to use Yammer because it's a cloud service, and IT might not ever know. Actually, they usually find out and say, what in the world is going on down there? It's like Salesforce used to avoid any sales interaction where they had to talk to the CIO. They would rather have the CMO throw down a credit card and just buy it and deploy it and everyone get to it on the web, right? They've discovered that eventually that has a certain plateau in their ability to sell, so they're starting to interact with CIOs. So it is possible a little bit for that, you know, bottoms up to happen through employees, but I think really to have, you know, the collaboration, communication, impact, benefits happen at scale, it'll have to be sanctioned, not just sanctioned, but encouraged by the enterprise, and that's the challenge that I was talking about.
I've got an Apple user in the front row.
Okay, so a point that was mentioned earlier by James was that the vendors, the online vendors, for example, Google and other advertisers, make money primarily from advertising. And that's because of the social economy, we're going to need some multi-sided business models. So my question is, do you think that Google's Google Plus not so successful attempt puts it at a disadvantage compared to Facebook? If Facebook, for example, wanted to launch an internal search in order to take advantage of the social and private information that they hold?
Unfortunately, can't comment to specific companies and whether they'll be successful or not. But I think what's interesting, though, just to generalize the conversation a bit, is that I think companies who have multiple ways to monetize are always going to be in a better position because you know, if you already have a very successful business that you're monetizing one way and you're entering another, you can afford not to have to monetize the new one, you know, for a very long time. Whereas somebody else who's competing with you, for whom that is the only business that they're doing, they're at a bit of a disadvantage. So I think, you know, what's interesting about these technologies, by the way, is that for the first time, you now have companies that are coming from multiple historical businesses competing for the same pool of potential money, right? So just to illustrate that as an example. So you've got Salesforce.com, which sells, Salesforce software, which is cloud-based. Now has a social platform called Chatter, but they have a traditional business called Salesforce.com. Google now has a Google Plus social platform, but they have a traditional business called Search, which monetizes through advertising. Then you've got Facebook, for whom the social platform is the business. There is no other, and we're trying to monetize one way. So all of a sudden you have different kinds of companies starting from different places, and you can make your own interpretations to what's likely to be successful or not. I mean, with those models. So can't comment on specific company success, but the business model question is probably for most of these companies is the fundamental question these days.
Other side of that, yeah.
So you spoke a fair amount in the report and in the presentation about the disintermediation. But I wonder if you can speak about the reintermediation that seems to be happening online, because this assumption that everybody's connected to everybody and it's just a cascade of information, and that it's just, yes, it's easy to press retweet, but there's crowding out of information, attention's an issue. So if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think you're starting to see reintermediation in different ways, right? So so people are sort of starting to. So if you look at, not everybody on Twitter, not everybody's followed to the same extent. So there are new, nodes, people who have massive followers, who all of a sudden are the equivalent, arguably, of what a famous, film review critic might have been 20 years ago, right? But it's a different reaggregation and consolidation around that's created in a very different way. So you are seeing new reaggregations. You're seeing, arguably, you could argue, per the example I gave earlier, while of course the music industry agent who used to sign up talent may have gone away, or at least is doing what they do differently. So do you call YouTube the new agent, given the fact that, there you can go to find out whose movie clip or music clip has been downloaded the most. So is that the new aggregator or the new reaggregator? So you're starting to see new structures basically form. I mean, the one that I found quite interesting, and these numbers are a little bit old now, but I think it's an interesting example. So it used to be that a couple of years ago, despite in the US, for all the Twitter traffic, there was a finite number, less than 1,000, of individuals who drove like 80% of all the traffic. Now, in terms of being followed. Now, think about an old world in which it used to be the case that if a company had free products, right, they'll probably pick people by demographic profiles to offer them. So if somebody had just opened a new, I don't know, new hotel, or new spa, or new something, they might pick the wealthy person or the person who fits a particular demographic, socioeconomic profile to say, hey, come try our spa for free, on the hope that you will tell everybody. Now in this world, if you happen to know who those 1,000 people are or less, in the Twitter, who would you make the offer to? Who's going to amplify the best? So you're starting to see new aggregations and new structures emerge to take advantage of the social structure that emerges within social media. I think to Michael's point, what may be more interesting about these new social structures is that they're not based on aggregate demographic information such as income group or age or whatever, which are indirect, but based on actual real behavior. Who are the people that people actually pay attention to and listen to? Because now we actually kind of know that.
Is that feeding back into an identity that's a new type of aggregate as well?
Exactly. I think it is. I think it is.
Yeah, it'd be interesting, of course, to see how much these new identities actually align with the old demographic identities. That's another question.
Right.
I'll go there and then there.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation and discussion. I'm interested in this untapped potential that you've mentioned, and the enterprise tools that would help us or help companies to reach this potential. So 3 quick questions in this respect. The first one, you said it is important to improve coordination and communication. Which one is the more important? The second one is maybe from your personal practice. Have you encountered any specific problems where you see there are no tools yet that would be able to solve this? And the third question is, where do you see the potential for startups to come in and help companies to tap into this potential, regardless of all the big players like Salesforce and Yammer?
Do you need any funding? No, a couple of reflections. Collaboration. I said collaboration, communication. You said coordination. Those are, I think, are all aspects of similar sorts of things. So I used a bunch of words. I wouldn't say it's communication, not collaboration. I think collaboration, you could view, I haven't thought through the definitions, right? But communication amongst a number of people in order to achieve a certain aim. So I do view those things, if not synonymous, as being part of the same cognitive cluster, and it'd be hard for me to say it's one or the other. What are some of the unsolved technical problems? The one I described, I think, is a huge one, which is, what's the equivalent of search for social, which is how do I make sure out of this torrent of social information that I get what's relevant to me for the task that I'm doing right now. I think that's, solving that is out there. And yeah, startups, we're early on, and despite some unfavorable valuations post IPO, there's still a lot of opportunity here, I think. So.
Well, the one thing I'd add in terms of, I don't know if you're a computer scientist or not, there's actually quite a lot of hard computer science problems that haven't been solved yet. I mean, I have a computer science background. I was in I used to do a lot of computer science, but I think there's a lot of AI questions. So if you're a startup, one of the interesting things is that the fastest growing amount of data is actually unstructured data. And much of that data actually lives in social networks. And so while of course today the social graph can capture what I'd call structured information, such as how often did you email each other or interact with each other, and where does most of the information seem to flow. So that's structured information that's easy to get. But the question is, how do you then layer on some of the meaning and that's in the unstructured information that's being passed on? So there's a lot of, those are very hard, almost AI computer science problems that are fascinating. And so there are a lot of, I know Silicon Valley where Michael and I live, there's a lot of startup activity looking at those areas, and there's still lots of unsolved problems. And I think that's a fertile ground for startup companies, because the other side of that, where you're mostly dealing with the actual data, that's hard if you're a startup, because it turns out that there are now a few entities that see most of the traffic and the data, right? So whether it's a Facebook or a Google, or so it's hard to enter as a startup to enter that part of it, because you start with a structural disadvantage and you're not seeing much of the data. But if you are a startup solving the more computer science kinds of problems, those are interesting. The other part of it that's also interesting for a startup is people who have ideas about how to solve the business model questions are also creating, there's interesting opportunities there. So it turns out that if you think about a lot of these multi-sided ecosystems or economics, somebody who Michael and I work with quite a bit is Hal Varian, and Hal used to work on a lot of these micro-auction models a long time ago in Berkeley. So there's a lot of economic models that have lived in theoretical academic land, but now all of a sudden potentially have applications in this environment. So there's a lot of potential to look at, are there some theoretical constructs in economics that didn't have applications before, but now you could actually apply? Because 50 years ago, you couldn't imagine the idea of running, billions of micro auctions around an AdWord in real time, and then monetizing that in a multi-sided business model. Well, that's what Google does, but because there's no place you could apply that, so it was a nice mathematical model in academia somewhere, but now as application. So I would think of the computer science problems as well as the more business model economics problems that I think startups could play with quite a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in my sort of linguisticsy world, I mean, grammatical analysis is easy, right, but material lexical analysis is incredibly difficult. I mean, that's the same Simpsons deal, yeah. And then I'm coming to the front row.
Taking the discussion a bit further from the commercial implications and taking it into the policy field, which is the one I'm interested in your big data report, you certainly hint at major policy implications, but you don't really get into them. I haven't read this one. I'm interested in knowing if you perceive a tension that I certainly do between a sort of 20th century industrial proprietary wealth creation model and sort of the model that Marc was hinting at, based on not only the sharing economy but based on open standards, based simply on ways of creating wealth that don't go necessarily through the traditional revenue streams. Are these models in tension? Are there sort of interests that are clashing in that field? And secondly, connected to that question, what will you make of the argument being made by people, technologists in Silicon Valley and economists, that no real innovation has been done in the past 20 years? And I'm talking about Peter Thiel, and I'm talking about Tyler Cowen. What do you think of that? Somehow is it that connected to the fact that it's basically based on commercial interest? I think the last number of the MIT Technology Review says something like, I was expecting colonies in Mars, instead I got Facebook.
Which may well be a colony in Mars. Yeah, I actually, just to add to that before answering the question, you may have seen there's an economist by the name of Robert Gordon, who's been arguing that, for example, we may be at the end of growth because none of these technologies, so his argument is that none of these technologies have been big enough in the way that electricity was, or in the way that, you know, some of the older technologies, and even those were basically one-time innovations, and we've mostly tapped out the benefits, and then that most of what we're calling innovation today are mostly small incremental things that may give this company or that company a competitive advantage, but don't actually drive societal level innovations or improvements. So you're right, there's certainly that argument and that tension. I don't know, I mean, I think one of the interesting questions is, in a world in which, so take the argument about the sharing economy, right? So much of, I'm going to other realms of work, other work that we do at MGI, I mean, I think clearly much of growth today presumes people are buying more things and we're spending more, and so in a way that adds value-added growth, and more things bought and consumed that add to GDP growth. So in a world in which at the extreme you're sharing everything and not buying as much, and we become more efficient, that we actually figure out the perfect way for you and I to share a car that never comes in conflict. So we never buy two, we just buy one, and we can perfectly match your use and my use, and so therefore net we have one car as opposed to two. You have to ask the question, what does that mean for growth as we've known it, right? So there is that tension. There is that tension. I think the argument I think you'd have to rest on is that, well, we've always found ways to ultimately innovate, and so something will come of these things. In fact, people have actually argued, by the way, and Peter Thiel's, makes this argument too, which is maybe we're about to get into a new Solow paradox round 2, right? Because if you think about the original Solow paradoxes, we didn't see any of this in the productivity, the impact of ICT in the productivity numbers, and we did in the 90s eventually, but most of that came through automating things and making things more efficient, whereas this new class of technologies, i.e. the social media, the internet, all of that is arguably has been all consumer surplus. It hasn't showed up in the productivity numbers or the growth numbers. So we may have another Solow paradox round 2 until we see the kind of productivity benefits that Marc and I were talking about, which haven't really fully played out yet, by the way. So I think there's a real tension. On your policy question, it depends at what level you're trying to apply the policy to. I think the policy things that we've certainly noted, although we're not policy types, so I think other more policy-oriented people have to take a look at these questions, are the tensions between questions of privacy, questions about data security, questions everything from cyber terrorism to what happens when you have the asymmetry of things that were locally contained within the group of 5 friends being, and the one bad actor amongst 5 friends being somewhat contained to now being at, cyber internet scale. So there are some real policy questions. We're not policy types at all.
Well, not professional. We like to talk about it, not in public. If I could just build on a couple of things that James said. On the policy question, I think there is a way to view it, and it's a good way to write books about, you know, there's the open world, and then there's the proprietary empire building, Darth Vader-ish corporate world, and I actually think in the, quote, real world, that this is a whole set of micro-negotiations, right, about what you're willing to give up privacy, about, you know, what one jurisdiction, what legislature is going to legislate, you know, something, you know, European Privacy Directive, you know, how someone is going to tweak, you know, what can be patentable, et cetera. I think there's a whole set of micro-negotiations, and yes, I think there's a certain amount in which, you know, you could view these things as worldviews in tension. But I think what actually happens is, you know, people fight the good fight daily in legislatures, in courts, in the market, and you know, as a friend of mine when I was in government said, you know, in the long run, people get the government they deserve. Right? And maybe in the long run, people get the IP policy that they deserve, right? But it, you know, it's a fight in a lot of ways, in both directions, right? And so I think there's a whole set of micro-negotiations.
I mean, part of that tension you saw that if you followed the SOPA debate,
Yeah, absolutely.
you saw the tension, look at who was lined up on either side
How
of
the
that.
coalitions formed.
And I was going to mention the Airbnb now, there's interest, lobbies that are trying to actually ban the business that Airbnb is getting
Yeah,
into.
Airbnb, or, you know, I don't know if you've heard of this Sidecar, right? Which is, it's like Uber. It's, you know, again, it's a mobile app where, you know, someone can come pick you up. But the people who pick you up, they're just people who have cars, and they decide. And in fact, they're trying to get around the legal restrictions about them not having taxi medallions
license or
by
whatever.
saying it's a suggested donation to the medallion, right? And then there's Lyft. There are these cars. They actually have these pink mustaches on them to identify them as, you know, another one of these services, right? So this fight is going to continue going on. And the other thing is, right, I mean, if you think about it, you know, to a certain extent, it's not really the sharing economy because you're paying, right? So,
Exactly.
you know, in another way, it is still a traditional way of, you know, people exchanging value, somebody capturing some surplus, etc.
Middle of the front row, and I'm going to take one more and end the formal discussion. That doesn't mean everybody has to go home, but that'll be the end of the taping, so you can relax, I suppose, at that point. Yeah.
I would have a question regarding the 1/3 that is kind of tapping the, let's say, call it the external, the open value. And I would be interested to see what you think are the biggest challenges for the companies that are maybe non-tech, like the large multinational that are not the Googles, the Facebooks of that world, that are now trying to move into capturing this value. Because I think that is, from my perspective, where the biggest challenges are, because there are many small firms which have started up and have learned what it means to kind of capturing that kind of value. And I can give you an example is like just how they think about openness. If you look at some of these smaller startups and how they share internal information with people in the social world, because they've realized that social media is not a one-way street, but it's kind of going both ways. So I would be interested, looking at the larger non-tech multinationals, what do you think are the biggest organizational challenges they face to capture that value?
I think most of them are cultural. So, you know, as you might imagine, you know, many of our clients are large multinationals, and it's actually interesting. So if you looked at the startup companies, I think they all adopt this stuff from day one. So they're all going down this path. The large companies, I think you see more disparity. So there's a few that have been unbelievable at how quickly they've turned and started to use these technologies. And then there are others who are just unbelievably slow. They think this is interesting, they kind of watch it, they think it has nothing to do with their industry. So the disparity amongst the large companies is actually very, very, very striking. But what's interesting about the ones who've been slow, they're being forced into it for two reasons often. One is, you know, consumers organize themselves and start commenting about their companies, so they kind of have to deal with it, right? They get bad reviews. Their stores and their branches, their retail stores get terrible reviews, so they kind of have to respond. The other one is that many of them are starting to see startup companies enter their space, so they're being forced into it. But I think the challenge is largely a cultural one and an approach one. So Mike and I could probably, you know, tell you stories another time about how you've had, you know, large company and the CEO mandates, we're going to use X. Everybody started using this. Of course, it doesn't work that way because a lot of these technologies are very you know, the users have a voice, right? I mean, we all pick the ones that we like. I mean, we kind of all, you know, kind of aggregate the ones that we like. We're not going to take a mandate top down. So I think part of it is also just the culture of change and how do you drive change. But it's I think, as some companies start to see their revenues get impacted, and some are starting to see that, particularly the ones that are in the consumer-facing industries, they're starting to see that. They're starting to see that, hey, you release that product that you spent 5 years researching, and it just bombs. You've seen some of that even in the electronics industry. Think about, you know, the electronics industry now has become such a hit product in a space where you release your latest thing. If it's not successful and doesn't catch fire in the next first month, it's probably dead. So apart from the iconic companies we all know, there's a huge number of technology companies who now realize that the world has just changed. Before they could release, they now realize they're in a hit product industry now. That's very different than them. So they're being forced to change as well. They're being forced to change as well.
I could add one other thing as well. You know, as James says, there's a mindset and capability issue around using social, et cetera. I think actually, you know, the next stage beyond that, because, you know, there's a shift, is, so for instance, one of the things that showed up in one of our interviews with the former head of Yahoo Labs, you know, people talk about things going viral, right? You know, Gangnam Style, over 600 million YouTube views. Right? You know, it turns out that the kink in the adoption actually happens when the social adoption hits mass media, and then the virality really accelerates. And so it's the combination of both, and that's the multi-channel challenge is actually extraordinarily difficult, because, you know, you might hire a bunch of 23-year-olds who know about social, and then you have the old people who know about TV ads, but it's the real power is when those things are combined, right? So like Old Spice, where people tweet and then they create an ad where the guy actually talks out of the shower, you know, about it. That was incredibly powerful, but because it creates those sort of feedback loops, which, you know, go through mass media, go through social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, actually, to Michael's point, one of the things we've actually found ourselves doing a lot of actually is mapping what we call these consumer decision journeys. And they're different product by product. In a social world versus, you know, and demographic by demographic. So it turns out that, for example, there are some products that we now, you know, not we, but you know, people who look at the social data now know that, for example, it turns out that most people only change their toothpaste usually when there's the window for when you could influence somebody's change of choice of toothpaste is usually when there's a baby about to be born in the family. That people are actually open to that question. Otherwise, people have picked whatever toothpaste they're going to use, and there's typically no reason to change that. But if you can somehow know that this family, you know, this event is about to happen in this window, certain kinds of advertising help, but also knowing, you know, is it an experience good where they're more susceptible to what their friends are using, or is it one of these things where they're actually just going to do, is it a researched good where you actually look at the product features and attributes, and is it something that will benefit from mass advertising? So you're starting to map these consumer decision journeys to start to understand, when do you apply what? When do you get, when does social media make the most difference? When does mass advertising make the most difference? And what are these events in people's lives when they make those choices? Doctors, same thing. The choice of when people choose and change physicians, it turns out usually follows a more age demographic profile as to moments. So people are starting to map these journeys and trying to apply when do certain marketing and technology events make a difference.
Yeah, I love the notion of Old Spice. That was 1950s technology as far as I'm concerned. One last question, if there is one. Otherwise, we'll.
Can I?
Yeah.
May I just make a quick comment? Just, there can be another question, but just on, I don't know your name. I'm sorry. Diego. Oh, hi, I do know. Yeah. On Diego's comment, just, and I thought you guys would say this, but I'll say it for you. I think that the point you were making about the power of these of social economy to go beyond existing firms and the commercial space. There's a chapter in the report on the social sector,
Yeah.
and I think that's where I think that there's an enormous amount of value to be created, trivially and conventionally, mobile health, mobile finance, et cetera, which is we don't have business models for, It's not controlled by large firms and probably won't be. I know Helen had to step out, but that's the space of e-government. It's the space of states newly playing acting roles in health and so forth, where the power of these technologies is enormous and transformative and will create enormous amounts of well-being. Whether that will show up as wealth or productivity is the debate. And so the other thing I was going to say, so I think really important point in the report, but the only point I was going to make there is it's also the prelude to this book that Michael and I are going to write about, kind of a philosophic critique of markets and wealth and productivity, right? Which is much of how we think about productivity today is a rhetorical legacy of a group of economists who in the 30s and 40s built the national accounts frameworks and gave us a false sense that market-based transactions capture value-producing activity, right? And in the same way that national accounts framework has, informed, several decades of macroeconomic studies and economic studies, econometric studies of productivity, we live with the legacy of an extremely restricted view of productivity. And so one thing that is possible and really open for grabs for everyone in this room if you decide to pursue a research or policy career is to reimagine things like productivity. And it may well be that these applications in, quote, bottom of the pyramid, which is an almost meaningless phrase, but in a variety of mobile health, mobile finance, mobile areas like that, we don't have models for that, we don't have analyses for that, we don't know who owns that, we don't have ways to kind of make metrics out of that. So I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but it's sort of the spirit of that chapter in some ways.
Yeah, I actually would agree completely. In fact, the question, we think it's a grand project for somebody to tackle this question. How should we be measuring these things? The productivity questions. I mean, one small improvement, by the way, that could be made, particularly in an environment where we are facing all these issues of unemployment is, so today productivity typically measures hours worked. It's per hour worked. But if you change the calculation to be per hour that could be worked, worked and could be worked, you suddenly get very different results, particularly as societies start to face issues of unemployment. So even the way we measure these things is problematic.
I think Stiglitz and Sen are doing some work with the French
Yeah.
government on this.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
I can certainly kind of hear Michael Sandel's voice in the room as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we'll pause at that point. Can we all thank Marc, Michael, and particularly the two of you who've struggled through the weather and across the Atlantic. I don't know how you've done it, guys.
It's a new thing to say. I can't wait to get to the warmth of England. It's unusual for me.
Thank you both very much. Thank you both very much. And thank you, I, for hosting the event.
Thank you all.